What up, everyone? This is Brenton.
And Jenna.
This podcast is all about connecting with our Autumn family in a fun and different kind of way.
So turn down that CB, buckle up, and enjoy the show. It's going to be truckin' awesome.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Autumn Transport Podcast. My name is Brenton. I'm joined by Jenna today. Jenna, how you doing?
Doing good, as usual.
Well, today we have a guest with us that is joining us to talk about a pretty cool thing we've mentioned before. Autumn Transport has been a part of the Wall That Heals program. And we have Tim Tetz with us today from the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund. Thanks for being here, Tim.
Thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome. It's our pleasure to have you and to talk a little bit more about this thing that Autumn has played a very small part in, but it's been something very significant and meaningful for us, and it's neat to have you here. Why don't we get started just with hearing about who you are, where you're from, a little bit about your background?
Sure. My name is Tim Tetz. Again, I'm the Director of Outreach with the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund. So we're the organization that in 1979 was created to build a memorial on the National Mall. In the ensuing 3 years after we held a contest and passed legislation through Congress to get that 3 acres, we developed and built what is now known as the Wall, the Vietnam Memorial. We added a few things over the ensuing years after that was dedicated. In 1984, we added the 3 servicemen and the flagpole. And in 1996, we realized that there were a great many people who couldn't get to Washington, D.C. or didn't want to come to Washington, D.C. And so we put out on the road what was known as the Wall That Heals. It was a replica version of the wall in Washington, D.C., and it was a half scale. We used that from 1996 all the way up until 2017. And in 2017, we kind of lost our minds and decided that we wanted to go bigger. And so we now have on the road a 3/4 scale replica of the wall in Washington, D.C. So it's 3/4 as tall at 7.5 feet, 375 feet long from end to end, fills up a football field, basically. And we travel around the country basically from March until November. Every single week, we're in a new community and bringing that wall, its museum, and the knowledge and healing that happens at the wall into a community for a week. We were very blessed in 2015 to begin a partnership with the trucking industry. So prior to that, we had been given a truck from a company, and we basically had 2 employees that were full-time drivers, and they just drove from place to place, and they would set it up and sit back and watch. And in 2015, we lost that truck. We decided to reach out to the trucking industry thinking that we could get ourselves another truck. And the greatest idea that was ever happened was when Brad said, you know what, you guys don't need to be in the trucking business. Let us be the experts there. You guys be the wall experts. And the partnership began where we have companies like Autumn Transport who literally give us a truck, a driver, and the transportation. And they bring us from one community to another for each of our stops throughout the year.
Very cool. Autumn has been a part of this for the last 2 years. We had a driver who hauled the wall for you down in Texas, I believe it was 2 years ago. And then this year it was from Wisconsin, right over near our office, which was pretty cool, over to Inver Grove Heights. And as part of that, the driver pulled the trailer by our office and was able to show it off to all of our office employees. And we put some pictures online and had a chance to look at that and actually did an interview with that driver that anybody can go back and listen to if they'd like to back in late May. But it was a very impactful day when just the wall came here to the office. And then I had the opportunity to drive over to St. Thomas Academy, which is where it spent the week, and to see all the cadets there out waving flags and welcoming the wall and hearing a presentation. We'll dig into that a little bit. You did bring a guest with you. You have Mitch. What kind of dog is that back there?
So Mitch is a yellow lab. He'll turn 10 this year, and Mitch has been my service dog for the last 7 years. So wherever I go, Mitch is with us, and he is happy to be there to assist or just hang out in the refrigeration, whatever it takes.
Yeah, it's too bad we had a black lab that was a part of our office life for many years named Summer. Mm-hmm. And she was the owner of our company's black lab. And we call her the official greeter because she would be at the front door when anyone new came in.
Sure.
greeting them and kind of following people around and getting little treats from people at their desks. So most of the drivers who have been here met Summer, and we miss her. She passed away
2022.
in 2022. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Mitch is doing a great job just hanging out.
There you go.
How did you originally get involved with the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund? Were you did you serve yourself and then want to continue that?
Yes, I served in the Coast Guard in the early 1990s, and after I got out, I started volunteering time on Capitol Hill to navigate legislation through, basically lobby. I did that from 1995 up until about 2012. And in my travels to Washington, D.C., I happened to be sitting in an office one day and ran into Jan Scruggs, who was the founder of the wall. And he was trying to get some legislation passed. And I was dealing with military and veteran issues at the time. And he kind of liked one of the presentations that I made on something totally different and asked if I would come and help him pass some legislation related to the wall. And so I started doing that in the mid-1990s all the way up until about 2012. And he came to me and asked if I wanted to come and get a job internally within the organization. And so in 2012, I joined permanent staff and have been with it ever since.
Great. How many people visit the wall, the actual wall in DC every year?
So last year it was almost 4 million came to the wall. It's the second most visited site on the National Mall, only behind the Lincoln Memorial.
Okay.
It's in the top 10 of the national memorials within the country, within the United States. And so it's got a whole lot of visitors that come to it. It's one of those iconic things that if you ever tell somebody that you're going to Washington, D.C., there are things that you have to do.
Right.
Going to the wall is probably right there on the list of, getting your picture taken outside the White House or, going to Congress. Not even those pale in comparison to you got to go to Lincoln, you got to go to Washington,
right,
and you got to go to the wall.
Yeah.
And the rest of them, there are all the memorials, all the wars have memorials now, but the wall was really the one that set it all off.
Have you been there, Jenna?
No.
Have you been to DC?
No.
On your list?
Yeah. Have you?
Yeah. I had the opportunity to go probably about 10 years ago. And just like Tim was saying, I hit up all those sites, and the wall definitely visited that and was impacted by that. My dad served in the Army, and he was very fortunate that he entered and was about to go to Vietnam right as we pulled out of the war. And so he was never actually deployed, but he was right there on the edge, ready to go towards the end.
Sure.
You were in the Coast Guard. Are you from the DC area? And how did you go from the Coast Guard to politics?
I had 3 or more stops after that, actually. So there's a long circuitous way there. Okay. I sold shoes for a long time. So no, I got out. I was originally from Northern Nevada. And so I had the opportunity to go to a couple different academies. And we had not been at war since Vietnam when I went in the military. And I decided I wanted to go do something rather than practice doing things. And the Coast Guard was a way I thought I could do that.
It wasn't just because you wanted to actually see some water.
Oh, no.
After being stuck in Nevada.
Well, I lived right next to Lake Tahoe, so we have a pretty good body of water right there.
Do.
But so no, so I went in and spent 5 years in the Coast Guard and then got back out. And I had gotten interested in the military in part through veterans that I knew. And so it was a natural thing to join up with the American Legion when I got back, help them with their Boy State program, which is their young leadership kind of program. And I kind of repaid that, and that got me involved in the politics piece, as a volunteer. And
you seem way too nice of a guy to be all mixed up in politics.
This is me trying to win back all the bad things that I did for decades.
Tim, one of the things that jumped out at me and it's really stuck with me since going to see the wall over at St. Thomas Academy, there was a man there that kind of welcomed the wall and gave a short presentation. And he talked about the fact that so many of the Vietnam veterans, they never got a true welcome home. They were either looked down upon or cast aside. There was a lot of strife in America at that time, and people had very strong opinions about whether we should have ever been there in the first place. And not wanting to get into that, of course, but he's talked about when you meet a Vietnam vet to use the phrase welcome home before you even say thanks for your service, because so many of them never received a welcome home. Is that part of what you guys try to work into every one of your speeches when that wall gets delivered? How does that resonate with you?
I think that one of the things you have to realize about Vietnam is it was the first war that we went to, a long-term war, that we went to with the numbers that we did, where we didn't send them over and bring them back in one unit. So you think about World War I, World War II, we sent folks over. They might have gone over in groups, but they were there for the duration of the war. Vietnam, of course, was it's now the second longest war. Afghanistan beat it at the final months. But Vietnam was a war that went on for more than, 15 years, 16 years. And so we would send folks over. They would serve there 1 year or 14 months, and they would come back. So they're coming back onesie, twosie. They weren't coming back as units. And that began the way that our nation had to sit there and welcome them back. And at the same time, as you point out, beginning in 1968, for the first time ever in America's history, going back to the Civil War, a majority of Americans, when polled by a national polling firm, were against the war. So World War II, World War I, even Korean War, the forgotten war, everybody was in favor of those, or at least a majority of Americans. There's always some Americans who are going to be against it. But in 1968, for the first time ever since Civil War, when you polled the American public, they were against it. And unfortunately, that American public took it out on the men and to some extent women who were coming back. And that's where they got labeled the baby killers, and they were hide their uniforms and walk away from their experiences. Very, very tragic. And that became the issue. So the problem then became, how do we welcome them home 20, 30, 40 years later? Mm-hmm. And they took that upon themselves, but then they also paid it forward. And so for those who served after Vietnam, when we went to war in the first Persian Gulf, for those who were in uniform, it was really weird when the Vietnam veterans all of a sudden were the first ones to go back to the young kids that were serving then and sit there and say, hey, welcome home, thanks for your service and everything else. And they were on the front lines to return that favor. That's the gift the Vietnam generation gave to the following generations, because they had made a promise to themselves that no one will ever be treated the way we were treated if we have to go off to war. And that legacy is something that bears fruit to this day. And so it's one of those pieces that no matter what, whenever we see a veteran, it's not just necessarily that welcome home, because even amongst the Vietnam generation, 8 million served during that 20-year period. But only 3/8 of them, only 3 million served in country. So there's no place to welcome them home if they were here stateside. But each and every person who wears a uniform, whether it was during Vietnam or whether it was stateside here in any of our wartime periods, deserved to have them come up to them, thank them for their service, and tell them how much you appreciate it. And that's a gift that we now teach our kids. I know Jenna was sitting there talking about her 2 kids. I mean, you teach your kids at the youngest of age. That's okay. That's a person in uniform. That's okay. That's a military veteran. You need to go over there and shake his hand and shake her hand and tell him thanks for your service. That's what became of the Vietnam generation, and that's how they paid it forward. And that's what we see each and every day at the wall.
Yeah.
That's super impactful. Do you see that happening, or what is, I guess, a story that stands out to you, a different impact that you've seen, like maybe happening at the wall, or just visitors that have talked about their experience there?
The great thing about the wall is who it brings out. 2 years ago, we were up here in northern Minnesota at a small town, and the truck driver was staying all week with us. And on Sunday morning, we got there early to do lights. And he said, well, you just missed a pretty important couple. And I kind of said, okay, tell us the story. And he said, I got up at 3:00 to have a cigarette and go to the bathroom or whatever. And I realized that there was a couple that was walking up. And, he was a veteran. He was there with his wife, and it was dark. And I figured I'd just greet him. And the guy asked me, well, how do I find a name, or I've got this list of them, how am I going to be able to do it? And he said, so I walked over there with him, and we walked up, and he said his wife sat down on the benches, and we walked up to the wall, and I showed him how to find the first one. And he said, all right, that's fine. I can find all the rest. And he had this list, lengthy list. And he broke down in tears in front of that first one. And I realized it was time for me to step back. And so I stepped back, and then I went back and I sat down with his wife. And he said, Tim, it's dark. Only the wall is lit. The only thing that's lit is the wall, and you could see him there. And then I saw him move to another panel, and you could see his body language as he grieved over another one of his fallen comrades. And I sat there and I talked to his wife, and she said, tell me your story. And she said, my husband, we knew for the last 9 months that this was going to come to town. It's come to the area. It's come to the region. He's never wanted to go, but this was going to be in our county, here in our hometown. And I told him, hey, let's go. And he said, yeah. And then she said about a month ago, he just stopped. He wasn't going to come. And he just couldn't do it. And he said, no, I just don't think I can do it. I just don't think I can do it. And we avoided the parade when it came in on Tuesday. We didn't come down for the opening ceremony. We've avoided the whole thing, and it's leaving this morning. And she said at 2:00 in the morning, he came in, he tapped me on the shoulder, and he said, I need you to get dressed. We need to go down and see the wall. And so she said, he doesn't ask much of me. He never talks about this, but this was his opportunity to say goodbye to his buddies and tell the story. And this is how it happened. And that was the reason why it's open 24 hours a day. That's the reason why we have those people there. And that is an experience that driver said, I get to see a lot of things and do a lot of things, but I got to see firsthand the healing of this guy and his wife, and see that closure that he had never had. And he was there for the better part of 2 hours before we showed up, looking at every single one. And we see that time and time again across the country.
Yeah, you can't put hours and limits on when someone's going to be ready for that,
That's powerful.
Yeah, it is. How do you, and I'm curious now, so you say people coming from all over, obviously. How do you guys plan then where it goes? Is there any sort of because I was reading some details and stats, and it's saying, there's a certain amount of people that gave their life from California or just certain regions. So how do you plan that route, or is there anything that goes into where the wall needs to be?
You forgot my story earlier. We're not truckers. We don't do this in a logical way.
Yeah, you don't dispatch. I avoided using the word dispatch.
I know. I appreciate that. There's nothing dispatch about us.
Right.
We usually accept applications from about May up until November.
So cities apply and ask to have the wall come
So
to
organizations come together and say, hey, we want to bring this to our town.
Okay.
And so we had about 103 applications last year. From that 103, we go through and we meet with all of them. We encourage them to come and visit one of the sites that we've already set up at, so they get to see it firsthand. They get to see how immense it is, how big it is, that it's not something that you can do with helicopter rides and the fair and barbecues next door. It is you're replicating the Washington, D.C. experience. So we have all of that, and then we go through and cull that down from the 103 to the 29 that we had. They've proven to us that they've put on an event. They've proven to us that they're a wide group of organizations that are going to be able to bring in the 200 plus volunteers. Mm-hmm. And then they understand and realize that this isn't part of the Artichoke Festival. And so, we piece that, say what you will about California or New York or anything else. It's the individuals within the communities who sit there and say, I want to bring this to home, that make that magic happen. And it is, when done right, incredible. And it is the talk of town for, months, if not years.
Do you do repeat cities, or do you try to pick new cities each year?
We don't go back to a city, but for once every 4 or 5 years. So this is the first year this has been 5 years since we were in our opening city. So we went out on the road. And so it was 5 years this year. And so we were going back to 3 cities that we had been with this new wall 5 years ago. But we won't usually go back into a community for 4 to 5 years. 1, you've burned through a whole lot of volunteers. 2, people have seen it. And to make that happen. And so it's just not quite ready. And we have 3, our first stop this year was San Luis Obispo. That was a repeat from 2017. We were somewhere else. And then we'll end up in Middletown, Indiana. It'll be the 3rd one too. So we do go back. Crivets, Wisconsin was the other repeat. We do go back, but sometimes it doesn't do as good as the first time.
Yeah. You had mentioned that one of the goals of the wall is to be able to give people the opportunity to experience the wall in DC without having to go all the way to DC. Numerous reasons why, maybe financial reasons, health reasons that people can't travel, maybe just feel overwhelmed by seeing the actual wall. And like the story you just shared, having the wall in that man's town enabled him to work through all those feelings and give it a shot close to home. How do you pick the things that are a part of the wall when they open the doors and there's artifacts and other things like that? Are those changing in and out? Do people donate those things to you and then you add them to the wall? How does that process work?
So what you're referring to is the Mobile Education Center. So back in 2006, one of the first pieces of legislation that I had passed was that we were going to build a museum next to the wall in Washington, D.C. And we were going to help educate about the war and the memorial and have the largest display case ever built that was going to display some of the 400,000 items that had been left behind at the wall. We got that passed. We started raising funds, and every time we turned around, it got more and more expensive. We started with it started at, I think, $14 million. And by the time it was finally canceled in 2015, it was $122 million. Wow. It just got too expensive to do. So we took that very same ideas and we put that into the museum that uses the wall. So the trailer that we haul the wall with, the wall that heals with, is a 51-foot, modified trailer. It opens up to become a museum. And you get to see two screens. One screen shows the photos of everybody from the community that we're at and the counties that touch that community, their names, their pictures, and who they are on the wall. Another one shows those folks from that state who have come back and died of illness and injuries related to their service in Vietnam. And then the last three are some of those 400,000 items. And we've changed them twice now. We did them originally, and after we looked at it originally, we were like, we're kind of missing this story, or we're kind of missing this story. We try to have stuff in there that everyone can relate to some extent, and yet are unique enough to cover the 3 million people's experiences there and the different branches of service. But the other piece is that every single one of those items has a story behind it that's going to make you catch your breath, or it's going to draw a tear, or it's going to make you laugh, because you're going to sit there and realize that, boy golly, how many times do you have clothes set aside that are your baby's firstborn shirt or sweater? Imagine if your son had died and you decided to come down to the wall and leave a hand knit sweater because you couldn't decide whether to bring his teddy bear or his hand knit sweater. We have that sweater there. So every single mother who's ever had to, raise a kid can realize that. And every single one of us can sit there and realize, my goodness, what a tough position for your mother to be in. On how are you going to memorialize your son who's been gone by bringing a toy or bringing a first clothing item?
Yeah. I think that speaks to Jenna's question, just kind of about some of the stories that you must just be hearing these things. How much do you travel with the wall yourself?
I think I'm out about 13 weeks this year with it. So we have a team. There's 10 of us, plus or minus. So we have a team. We usually have 2 to 3 people who are there every single week. So this week we're going to be in Monticello. And we'll be lucky that we have 3 this week. But it's usually 2. And usually end up going out every 3 to 4 weeks. But I oversee the whole program, so I have to go out with everybody at least once as well.
Sure. It's got to be pretty overwhelming for the volunteers and for yourself to continually hear these stories and greet these people week after week.
Yeah, the psychological and emotional toll that it makes on you, it's long days. I mean, they're 12 to 14-hour days in all sorts of weather conditions. But it's the psychological and emotional tolls that are on it that are, that just level you when you least expect it.
Yeah.
When you're, I did an opening speech 2014, I guess, or maybe 2013. And after I got off the podium and walked around to the back of the audience, somebody came up to me and said, well, Tim, do you know who that person was that, you know who Ernie was? And I was like, no, I don't. It was a name that I knew was from your town. I knew that there was a story that he had given his neighbor a ride home. She was in 3rd grade. He was in high school. She needed a ride home. She picked him. She asked, and he gave him a ride. They were all at one, small community school. He gave her a ride back out to the farm, and he got in trouble for giving her a ride, and she got in trouble for taking a ride from Ernie. And I gave it because you guys brought Ernie home. You brought Ernie to town by bringing the wall here and everything else. And I thought that that was just an appropriate message of, this girl needed a ride home, and you guys brought Ernie home this week. And he goes, no. But there's more to it. And I said, okay. And he goes, Ernie's mom was like the figurehead of the community. And in fact, if you wanted to learn how to swim in Willows, California, she was the one who taught you how to swim. I said, all right, that's fine. Great. Wonderful. And he goes, so many of us learned to swim. Great. And he said, and after Vietnam, Ernie's mom put up one of the first memorials to everybody who died in the area by going to the businesses and saying, oh, by the way, you owe us money because we're going to build a clock tower downtown and it's going to have all the boys' names on it. I was like, oh, that's fantastic. Perfect. And he said, no, you still don't get it. And I go, obviously not, but I'm sure you're going to tell me. And he goes, Ernie has a cousin. And I said, okay. And he goes, Ernest B. Hanks. His cousin is Tom Hanks. Tom grew up in this area. They were inseparable all the way up until, he was a young teenager, and Ernie stayed here. Tom goes down to Southern California as his family moved down there. And of course, the rest is history. We all know Tom Hanks and the hero that he is and the Forrest Gump and everything else. And Ernie, he went from here and everything else. And I got a picture of Ernie, and you look at the picture on our website of Ernie, it looks exactly like Tom Hanks. And you just sit there and go, those are the stories that you can't possibly imagine when you started off that day. That is, and then to know how that community rallied around it. And that to this day, the clock tower is still there and everything else is still there.
That's pretty wild.
Wow.
Very wild.
Yeah.
Do you have anything in the works for the next few years with the Wall That Heals? Is the system kind of on autopilot? Is there anything you can, any hints you can drop for us about what might be coming down the pipeline or down the road, so to speak, in trucking?
So there's nothing, as you know, in the transportation business, there is nothing like autopilot on any of this. Just when you think you have it figured out, somebody throws you a curve. But we are probably going to do some small revisions of it, probably not this off season, but next off season, switch out some of those things in the display cabinet, and do some overall maintenance, but it's been in great shape. We're probably trying to figure out a way that we can highlight the men and women who came back and died since that. You have 3 million. And if you talk to anybody, and your dad included in that, you talk to anybody who served during the Vietnam War, their lives were changed by it. They came back dealing with everything that they had to deal with.
So to be clear, you're saying you have all the names on the wall of the men and women who died in service during the war, but now the men and women who served came home and have since passed here. What would you call it? Stateside?
Yeah.
How do you incorporate them? That's what you're mentioning?
Well, they're incorporated through the in-memory plaque. So the in-memory plaque was dedicated in Washington, D.C. in 1996, or 2012, the plaque was dedicated. But we started the program in 1996 of saying, okay, let's gather these names and let's recognize them. It's the largest ceremony that we have each year at the Wall in Washington, D.C. And that's when the families come into town and they read the names of their loved ones. And it's done on Father's Day weekend, takes 3 hours, and 600-700 more people get recognition. We build a website for them, just like the website for each of the people on the wall. And we have a full-scale replica of that memorial that travels with us with the Wall That Heals. But a lot of those families want more. And so we're trying to figure out a way, if there's a way for us to travel around with a first-of-its-kind memorial to everybody who served. And so, the wall was created through the largest ever art and architecture contest of its time. If you were an American citizen and you had $20 and you were over the age of 18, you could submit an idea. The winner got $20,000 for coming up with the idea, and we put her idea and made it into the wall. And it's famous for that. Now that our nation has gotten different, now that we can travel around in ways that we wouldn't have imagined in the 1970s, how about we bring a national memorial to your town of the people who came back, the people who were not greeted as they should have been when they came back, the people who suffered in our midst, and they were our scout leaders and our teachers and our parents and everything else, and have since died. And we grew up underneath them learning those stories. Sure. We could bring that memorial into town with the wall, of course, too. But we could bring that into and make that special. And, of course, now with 40-some years since the development of the wall, you can do something technology-wise that we couldn't have even imagined in the 1970s, that you can do with the names and videos or whatever you wanted to do. It's the creativity to make that. That's a pipe dream for us. But I think that we have been, over the years, since 1996, been to all of the United States except for 2. And we've been to Canada and Ireland with the wall. And so I'm very optimistic that we'll be able to check off one of those 2 in taking the wall, hopefully this off season, over to Hawaii or something, and bring it to the folks there.
You just slipped in Ireland.
Yes, sir.
What's the connection there? Why would the wall go to Ireland?
So Fred Smith was the founder, of course, of FedEx fame, Vietnam veteran himself, and probably one of the more famous Vietnam veterans who came back. Fred Smith was a long-standing supporter of the organization, and he and our founder, Jan Scruggs, dreamt up the idea of, let's take it to Ireland, because there are a number of folks on the wall from Ireland that were serving in our military. Let's take it to Ireland and show it off in Ireland. And so Fred put it on one of the giant planes that FedEx flies.
Wow.
It was the old wall, so it's not this new one. This one's way too big and heavy. Put it on a plane, flew it over there, and we did a couple weeks in Ireland with it and did it. So it's pretty great legacy.
Yeah, that is really interesting.
Yeah.
I think this is such a cool thing and such an important thing. It's one of the reasons I wanted to try to get you here to talk about it. It was great to hear from our driver about his experience. He talked about how impactful it was for him, like in your story of the man in the early mornings. Our driver that we spoke to would talk about people that he talked to and hearing their stories and how impactful it was. And my son, actually, he's 16 years old. He listened to that interview. And unfortunately, he's away at Bible camp this weekend because he said, "Dad, I want to go to Monticello. I want to see the wall."
Yeah.
And I'm not a veteran. My grandfather served. My dad served. Honor our vets, and I'm so grateful for them. And this type of thing that you guys are doing is a way for me, as someone not as military minded, to pass that along to my children, though, and to teach them, like you said, about the importance of honoring everyone who served and being thankful and greeting them and thanking them for their service. So I think that's another audience of the wall when it goes to cities, besides the friends and family of those who gave their lives. But it's to teach. And you said you have the mobile education center that's a part of the trailer. So it's really, I can't stress to anybody how much they should go see this thing, right, Jenna?
Yeah. Yeah, it was pretty impactful, even just being out back here at our office. And I can't imagine if it were to get bigger or, like some of the things you were talking about.
So our drivers are all over the country. We're not just, we're based here in Minnesota, but we service the entire nation. If anybody's listening to this in another state, how do they find the wall? How do you know where it's going to be and when you can go see it?
So our main website is thewallthatheals.org. And from that, you can look up the schedule. You can look up what it takes to host the wall and go from there. You can even go into the sublink, which is to haul the wall. So if you've got drivers who, like Ray, want to join us and, come on out, we start taking applications for our drivers to haul legs in January. After the season schedule gets announced in November. And so it's a situation of coming on board. And like Ray had to, the first year he did it, he had to come all the way down to Texas, which is way out of his lane. I don't remember where he left his truck. I think he left his truck in San Antonio, and it was very convoluted for him to make it because that was the leg that was open for him to earn a spot basically amongst that. Because last year we had 29 companies for the 28 different legs, so it was a tremendous effort. This year we didn't have quite as many companies, but Ray was earlier in the process, so he could get a spot that was a little closer to home.
Sure.
So getting on board, we open that up in January and usually bring in 4 or 5 new companies each year as that fits out. You've got to have a huge truck. Mm-hmm. Obviously some of your trucks can do that all day long, but you got to have 92 inches between the back of your truck and the center of your kingpin. And so that ruled out a lot of our trucking companies that from 2015 all the way up to 2017 or with us, but they're hauling dry vans. And when they try to, shorten that distance, it doesn't work for us anymore. And so having those big trucks makes that work. And then, of course, having veterans or people who understand it makes all the difference in the world. And before we went on, one of the things that blew me away back in 2015 when we made this partnership is they said how much this was going to help the truckers, how great it would be to bring this home. And I don't think I really realized it until I saw the first couple, drivers. Those drivers who, just like you, were on that parade. They started off and they were their normal gruff, person that you would, nod to, but you wouldn't expect to get a smile or a tear out of. And then they got done with that 45-minute escort into town, and they got out of that truck and there was a tear in their eyes or more. And they were moved by it and said, my goodness, I've been driving a truck for 20, 25 years, and that was special. That's the magic that we get to have once a week, and bring that to drivers and give them that opportunity, like you said, to thank them for their service. And when they get there and they bring these heroes home, to welcome them home.
Mm-hmm. And if a driver wants to participate, they can throw their name in the hat through the website, thewallthatheals.com. .org.
Yes, sir.
And they can sign up there. It is an expense that drivers incur. They use their own truck. They pay their own fuel. They have to take time off from whatever they're doing at their current company. But I know Ray and every other driver, I assume, who's participated looks at it as small sacrifice compared to the sacrifice that they're honoring by pulling that wall into the city.
Absolutely. Absolutely agree.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you want to touch on about what the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund does, or anything like that our listeners might be interested in?
No, I think we covered the big pieces. Obviously, we built the memorial 40 years ago, and the memorial is on autopilot as it gets. That in-memory program, ask, if you're listening to this, who do you know that was a Vietnam veteran and they came back forever changed? And are they still with us? Because if they're not with us, go on to our website and make sure that you sign them up through that in-memory program to honor them, because they deserve to be memorialized for their service. They didn't die in Vietnam. They can't be amongst the 58,000 on the wall, but Vietnam took them from us. Their lives have been shortened because of their experiences. So getting that out there. And then just making certain that whenever you get an opportunity to see the wall that heals, if it's in a nearby community, come be a part of that. But first and foremost, live out that ideal that the Vietnam veterans gave to all of us. And that is to make certain that everyone who puts on the uniform to give us the freedoms that we have, recognize that they made that sacrifice for us. And so the least you can do, not just on Veterans Day or any other holiday, but the least you can do anytime you see one of them is just to take a moment and say to the veteran, thank you for your service. That'll mean the world to him.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah. Well, thanks, Mitch, for sitting so quietly in the background there. Tim, thanks for taking the time to come down to the office here and to share about this. It's a great program. I'm really excited and happy to try to get the word out to as many people that I can about this, and look forward to Autumn continuing to participate. We got, Jenna, how many veteran drivers do we have? Would you guess?
Oh, man.
At least a
More
third?
than I thought. Yeah, I would say.
Yeah, so
pretty
we have,
heavy focus
of 134 drivers, at least a third of them have served, and we love to try to recognize and support them. So thank you guys listening for your service, for those of you who are vets on the fleet, and to anyone else listening. We're just really grateful for what you've done. Thank you, Tim, for being here.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate the time.
Everyone, thank you today for listening to the Autumn Transport podcast. If you would, please go and give us a follow on our social media channels on Facebook or Instagram. I'd encourage you to share this episode on your own social with friends and family, as I think the topic we talked about today is really important for everyone to think about and to be a part of. Thanks again. Have a great day and drive safe.